my particular background with the notion of double bind comes from the history that I had with Gregory Bateson. Gregory Bateson was one of my teachers. I first started studying with Bateson at around the same time I studied with Richard Bandler and John Grinder. So Gregory was as much a part of my understanding and my development in NLP in some ways as Richard and John was. And Gregory, of course, was an important influence in the beginning of NLP. He is the one that put Bandler and Grinder in contact with Erickson, because he had a long-standing relationship with Erickson stemming back to the 1930s, and had sent many people down to try to understand Erickson, including Haley and Watzlawick and many others, and finally sent down Richard and John to try to make sense out of what Erickson was doing. And in the 1950s, Bateson started to, he was, as you might know, he was a biologist. Actually, he was an anthropologist by training. His father was a biologist. In fact, his father, John Bateson, was the person who coined the term genetics. And Gregory Bateson is named after Gregor Mendel. And Bateson's father rediscovered the obscure writings of this monk, Gregor Mendel, and brought them into the 20th century and found it essentially through used these statistics that Mendel had done, in studying the acquired characteristics of peas, to begin the field of genetics, which, of course, today has led us to other interesting double binds in terms of genetic research and studies and so on and so forth. So he had this very deep background in biology and in anthropology. And in the 1950s began studying, it was very interesting, Bateson was involved in the study of play. And what was play, and how did animals and humans play? And he began to notice that a very interesting thing occurred in play. That in play, animals and humans do many of the same exact behaviors that they do with aggression, sexuality, and very serious behaviors. And yet, so they actually are doing the same kinds of behaviors, like when two baby tiger cubs fight, they're fighting. And yet it's considered play. And so he said, well, what's going on here? And he realized that very often there were subtle cues or messages that were sent, so that if a dog wags its tail, it's a signal, this is play. Or it's a coda. No, you have to hear Edna's joke about a coda later. But coda means tail. That becomes a signal, and if you do not see or interpret that signal, you will misjudge the behavior. If the dog puts its ears back, it usually means this is not play, this is serious, stuff like that. And from that, Bateson began to go into study things relating to behavioral disorders. And one of the first things he studied in the 50s was the whole issue of schizophrenia. One of the first things that he noticed in the study of schizophrenia was that people who were schizophrenic consistently made misjudgments about precisely those kind of cues. And his example was a young man, schizophrenic man, walks into the hospital pharmacy, and the nurse behind the counter says, "May I help you?" And the young man does not know, is she chastising me? Is she actually asking me, does she want to help me? Is she propositioning me, sexually? Because those same words could be used in a lot of different ways. But what he misjudges is not the message itself. The message gets across loud and clear. It's the so-called meta-message. All the stuff that goes in interpreting what does she mean when she says that. From there, Bateson began to look at the so-called etiology of schizophrenia. Why is it that they consistently do that? According to Bateson, Norbert Wiener, the guy that started cybernetics, asked him this very provocative question in the 50s. Norbert Wiener said to Bateson, if you were going to create a machine that was schizophrenic, how would it have to behave? What would it be like? What would be this device? And the best answer that Bateson can come up with is that it would be like a telephone switching system, right? That you have country codes, then area codes, then prefixes, then numbers. So you have all these levels of messages. Here's the country code, here's the city code, here's the prefix, here's the number. And he said that in this telephone switching system, in order to be schizophrenic, would receive all of the numbers exactly correctly. It wouldn't be like there was noise on the system, and it wouldn't confuse a 4 for a 9 or something. But what it would do is it would confuse the city code for the country code, or the message, the actual phone number of the house for the city code. It would just mix up all of these different messages. So if you dialed this number, you may randomly get that this part happens to have been used as the country code. So you never knew where you were going to end up when you dialed the numbers, even though all of the numbers were interpreted exactly correctly. When he began to try to search for where does that come from, one of the interesting things that he noticed was that very often that in the family systems of these people that they were characterized by this kind of double binding. And also beyond that these people would tend to create double bind situations through their own behaviors. I've had this kind of experience with somebody who has the symptoms that we would call schizophrenia, where I would constantly feel myself put into double binds. And of course the person himself or herself would be in double binds. Just as a simple example, I remember I was in a class with John Grinder, and there was this lady who was having these symptoms of psychosis. And she suddenly stood up in the middle of the class and started to come up to the front of the room in a rage. And I knew the person. And so I could tell that she was obviously upset. And I reached out to touch her as a way to make contact. And her response was, in this very angry voice, she said, "How could you anchor me when I'm helpless? Don't anchor me when I'm helpless." And it was like the most bizarre feeling because it was like everything in her behavior was the opposite of being helpless from the typical point of view, right? She seemed enraged and angry, and my intention wasn't to anchor helplessness, but that was the projection. And I felt like the whole reality was reversed. That my intention was to comfort somebody who was upset, and what was being interpreted that I was anchoring helplessness in somebody. And you begin to really realize that situation becomes it's not just that the person is in an inner struggle because of history, but it's recreated over and over. And so one of my goals, and this has to do with my part of the history coming into this, is that I learned from Bateson very much the importance and the reality of these kinds of double binds. That is, that they really could. In my feeling in that moment, it was also, by the way, it was being in front of a group. So there was other people involved. It wasn't just me and her. It would have been different. But it also had to do with the fact that others were observing. And my feeling was this really kind of strange sense where reality suddenly you start to question, what's going on here? And you feel trapped. So I have definitely my own personal experiences with that. And I also did, a lot of my original work in NLP, my original experience I got from volunteering in a locked ward psychiatric facility and working with people who were diagnosed psychotic, schizophrenic. I was actually in a class, one of Bateson's classes, that was a requirement. You had to have direct experience with people diagnosed as psychotic or schizophrenic. And you could really, I saw the reality of these things. Since that time, I've also seen how that happens socially in companies, in countries, in, of course, families, and the results of it are not pretty. It really is crazy making. And I even feel, by the way, that the treatment of psychosis is itself, a double bind. So it was one of the things, though, that Gregory never quite did. Gregory was really good at understanding how things happened, but he was not necessarily really good at figuring out how to solve them and how to apply it practically. And I felt one of my own personal missions was to try to take this using the tools of NLP and chunk that down into the specifics. What are the skills that would allow us to get out of them? And that's kind of my entry into this.
And I'm just a person with experience. Having been raised in a fairly normal family. So it's not like I was put into those double binds a lot within my family. But my experience is just observing them and trying to figure out with certain clients that you work with, even when you're doing a conflict integration, where, well, it seems to be of two minds, why is this not working? There must be something else to it that's creating this.
How would I say? Double binds are built from about a half a dozen characteristics. And I don't think that double bind is the kind of thing where you're either in one or not in one. I think you can be 1/6 of the way in a double bind, or a half of a double bind, or 3/4 of a double bind, etc. And so, that actually, and that colluding and colliding belief deals with some aspects of the double bind. And so we'll be exploring all of the different ways that like we might call it the degrees of double bind. How much of a double bind are you in, and how much choice or possible flexibility do you have? So colluding and colliding belief to me is not intended to be a complete solution to double bind. In fact, I don't know that there is a complete solution. I think there are different pieces, any one of which and many of which we can develop skills to address.
So if you do the small chunks that you're going to learn today, and you do all the small chunks, then you'll have a much greater chance of getting yourself out.
Yes. Well, the first thing is, let's begin to explore the difference between, for example, things like choice. Free choice is probably what we would consider the opposite of a double bind. What is free choice? Free choice is when I have multiple options, but I win either way.
I can do whatever I want.
I turn on my television, I've got 57 channels, and I go, each one has something I might be interested. I'm going to choose to watch the channel that gives me the most of what I want. That's free choice. I get to choose from many possibilities. What is it that starts to make something a conflict? Let's ask you that.
So what makes it a conflict?
What's the difference between free choice, where I have many options, I choose the one I want the best?
Yeah.
The two options have the same value or the same priority, then I'm going to have a conflict.
Well,
that's one way.
I think that's one thing, that there's nothing that is clearly more. Mm-hmm. So the point is, things are equally weighted, and so I start to enter in a little bit of a conflict because I go, well, I'll get just as much if I do this as I do that. So there's no clear option that fits my criteria best. I think that's one.
I think the choice would have either actual or conceptual consequences.
Yeah, and that those consequences may actually not give you more of what you want, but less. Mm-hmm. In other words, start to think what we said about in the very beginning about win-lose. In choice, free choice, it's win-win-win. Whatever I take, it's I win.
Yeah.
Okay. In conflict,
it feels like win-lose.
Yeah. So guess what? So what is it, of course, that's going to turn even the conflict into the double bind? It's going to be, I'm going to lose.
Doesn't matter.
See, even in a conflict, I go, okay, if I choose this, if I win here, I'm going to lose there. Okay, and I decide. I choose, okay, I'm going to make the decision that because I'm going to win here, I'm going to get a little less of that. But, I mean, I know in my life, I remember realizing at a certain age, I couldn't do everything. I wasn't going to be able to be a chemist and a physicist and a psychologist and an anthropologist and an artist, even though I loved all these things, that I was going to have to make choices. And that those choices would mean that I would get less of something in order to get more of something else. So it's still a kind of a struggle. It's a conflict. But then to get to the double bind, you're going to lose no matter what you do. And it's an interesting thing. You're going to see, very interesting thing in some of the examples that we give you, how the word choice is used, especially in the example of the so-called Sophie's choice. You know, what are you choosing?
What are you choosing between?
Yeah. And is it, the question is it really a choice, or what kind of choice is it? So the word choice becomes quite interesting in the so-called double bind. Gregory Bateson used to illustrate it with the story of the bread and butterflies from Alice in Wonderland. Alice is talking to, I forget who it is, it's the Mad Hatter or somebody, and they're talking, I forget who it is. Anyway, it's about the bread and butterflies, and they're talking about the different insects that live in Wonderland. One of them is the bread and butterflies, and she says, well, what's a bread and butterfly? And I says, well, their wings are made out of thin slices of buttered bread, and their head is a lump of a sugar lump. And she goes, oh, what do they eat? And the character says, well, they like weak tea with cream. And she starts to think about it, and she says, well, it's kind of interesting if it's going to eat weak tea with cream and its head is a sugar lump. What happens to a sugar lump when you put it in contact with tea? Well, it disintegrates. It's going to die. She says, well, what happens if they don't find any? And says, well, then they die. So she says, so they must have a difficult time, surviving. And the teacher says, yeah, they always do. They always have a difficult time. And again, the point is, it's a double bind. If you eat, you die. If you don't eat, you die. And that's an interesting question. So which do you choose? Do you choose
going to
to eat or to not eat? I think that's that interesting thing about the double bind. Now, there's another characteristic, and this is actually, I think, a place where we want to start, too. And this is the thing that makes double binds particularly interesting with our first video clip. As I was saying, Bateson started his idea of exploring double binds, and in particular schizophrenia, because of this interesting phenomenon of misinterpreting different, what we would call, levels of communication. That wagging the tail, the dog wagging its tail while at the same time it's baring its teeth or biting, is a meta-message. The wagging the tail of the dog while it's biting you, it's saying this is just a play bite. It's not a real bite. And very interestingly, then, this is a different level of message or a different level of communication. Now, in human beings, we can also meta-communicate. I can actually say to you, look, I'm just kidding. I'll go, blah, 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 just kidding, That's what we do on April Fool's Day. We go, oh, there's a spider on you. Oh, just kidding, And so we give a meta message about an actual message. And very often, what you'll find is that instead of qualifying or clarifying, sometimes these different levels of messages start to confuse the message. And you end up getting what you call circular logic. And one of the interesting things, by the way, that makes double binds often hard to sort out is that the consequence that Tiana was talking about is not on the negative consequence is not on the same level as the other consequence.
So they're mixed up somehow. One's at the behavior, one's at the identity.
Yeah. So if we do the behavior and get a good result on the behavior, we get a positive result behaviorally, we get a negative consequence on a values level.
We're a bad person.
Yeah.
Somehow.
So consider the double bind, of course, typically of addiction. I get something positive from taking the substance, but on the longer term, it's got negative consequences. So it's a win-lose. And again, I think that's part of what starts to make things very challenging. I want to say one other thing, I think, before we show this, too, that Susie and I were talking about yesterday, which is I personally believe that if we start expanding what Bateson was talking about in terms of mental illness to what we might call in NLP mind-body illness, we begin to realize that psychosis is not only something that happens mentally, that in fact some people, I believe, instead of getting mentally psychotic, become physiologically psychotic. And my example of that would be something like cancer. Physiologically, cancer is like a psychosis of the cells. The cells go crazy. That's even the way you describe it. They're chaotic, they're crazy, they don't fit in, they create problems, it gets out of control. exactly the physiological behavior in the body that psychosis produces in social systems and community systems. And so what I think sometimes is that instead of going insane here, people will go insane in other places.
Yeah, I started paying attention to the feeling that came up right here every single time I got approached by somebody about why can't I come to this workshop? And it's like, well, so if I maintained that over time, because I was in the circumstance that required me to keep thinking about this or kept bringing this issue up, I can imagine what that would do to my body. Not dissipating it, not letting loose of it.
It's an interesting thing. I remember even with my mother when I was first working with her and helping her in her own healing from cancer, she felt trapped a lot and was in a lot of double binds. And I remember her actually saying, it was like there was no decision that she could make. She was in a certain felt trapped in a certain part of her life. And there was no decision that she could make that she would feel good about. And the only escape that seemed possible was death. And when she saw herself dead, like laying in a coffin, she thought, boy, that looks awfully peaceful.
And that is one of the choices, to leave the field. I mean, that's really the way to leave.
As we talk about, that's one of the conditions of the double bind. It has to do with being able or not to leave the situation, to so-called leave the field. And people will go to extremes at times to leave the field.
Get out.
And in fact, one of the conditions that Bateson says of a double bind, for double binds, is that it is not a single experience like we often think of as an imprint.
Yeah.
It is a repeated experience, and the repetition creates double bind over double bind over double bind.
And you get more and more confused about it. It's just like dig a deeper hole. Yeah.
So very often double binds then have this issue of so-called circularity. So and of course the idea of catch-22 is an example of circularity.
Yeah, but if that guy, and I mean I think throughout the whole movie he's always trying to find Major. And he can never talk to Major because the only time you can talk to Major is when he's in his office, when he's there, and when you go in, he's not there. So it's like, if this guy were doing this every day, trying to talk to this guy, pretty soon you can imagine being in that kind of confusion where it's going to leave you. It's
right.
And the history behind it is Major didn't want to be made a major. And so he's going to he doesn't know what the hell he's doing. So he's going to avoid people at all costs, and that's what he's doing. Climbs out the window. Which,
by the way, gives you an interesting insight into the creation of paradox and double bind. So he just said he doesn't want to be a major. That is, he does not accept the identity or the role that he's given.
In charge.
Meaning the majors of a double bind, too.
Yes.
Right, that's it. Yeah.
This is part of what we're going to find, because one of the big questions that I've asked people, and that has been a surprise, especially to people who did have family systems where there was a lot of double binding, the most challenging question is, what's the positive intention? And that is a dumbfounding question to people who've been in double binds. What the hell do you mean, what's the positive intention of a double bind? It seems like one of those things that's the exception to the rule, doesn't it? And yet, I think that is probably one of the most important things for us to seek. How do we find the positive intention of the double bind? Because that's part of our way of healing it. So we'll see. You might hold that question. You don't have to answer it, and you can still even keep thinking maybe there isn't one. But I think it's also interesting to think, if there was one, what would it be? What could it be? Possibly could it be?
It's interesting, too, in the paradox of Major, in my theater and directorial standpoint, is his name alone. Right?
Yeah.
Because his last name is Major, he doesn't want to be Major, so he made him Major, he can't be himself. So let's turn him to identity level and confuse the daylight.
Yeah. Did y'all hear what Yvonne was saying about Major, that you've got this, it's even doubly, you get again these very interesting logical level confusions. His last name is Major, that is who he is, but he doesn't want to be a major. And again, you get a lot of that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's right.
So, yeah.
Whoa.
The notion of how this creates this.
So something external to it, like the military organization,
Right.
confused him at an identity level.
Yeah. 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 Let's go on to the actual notion of the catch-22. And you heard the beginning of it was he said, I've flown all these missions, and he doesn't want to fly more missions. Interesting things there. First of all, he says, okay, can you let me fly if I'm crazy? No, I absolutely cannot let you fly if you're crazy. Okay, I'm crazy. Well, how do I can't trust you to tell me. Okay, then have somebody else tell me.
And the guy comes over, yeah, he's
crazy.
He won't fly with me.
He says, yeah, but I can't accept what he says because he's crazy. Otherwise, he wouldn't fly like that. The fact that he's flying the missions is obviously proof he's crazy, and a crazy person can't tell you that somebody else is crazy. So then he goes, okay, but if he's crazy, don't you have to ground him? And he says, yes, absolutely. Okay, well, why don't you? Well, he has to ask.
Yeah.
You can't ground them unless they're asked to be grounded.
So great. All I have to do is ask.
No, then I cannot do that, because a crazy person would not ask.
If you're smart enough to know that you shouldn't flex your obvious
Right.
then have to be right.
And by the way, how many of you in here have worked with people who are diagnosed as psychotic or schizophrenic? Okay. One of the things you realize, and I got this, by the way, become more and more obvious to me when I work with people like that, is that that's their perspective too. And you start realizing that there's a lot of truth to it, that it's somebody who's crazy is telling me that I'm crazy. And in fact, sometimes you have a crazy system. You have a system like this that doesn't seem to be, it seems crazy to have this kind of paradox, and yet that's the system that's determining you're crazy. And so you get these extremely convoluted things. There's been plenty of films, too, about how the ones who are determining that somebody else is crazy are just as crazy. Maybe in a different way, but they're just as crazy. And, there's even those things about, who is really the crazy ones here? Is it the ones in the Institute or the ones running the Institute? Or the ones out of the Institute?
Hard to tell sometimes.
And it's very interesting. I was a college student. I remember I was volunteering. I remember one time I went in, it was a locked ward facility, right? And by the way, this particular facility was in California during the Reagan years. And Reagan, at those times, was reducing a lot of public funding for things. And one of the things that was cut was any funding for mental health facilities. And one of the results that came out of that was that the facilities then had to support themselves, which was a good idea and was a nice thing. The only problem with that was, that maybe you could call it the catch of it or whatever, was that in order to make money, you can't necessarily cure people. You have to treat people. And the best way to make money was through drugs. And the facility that I worked in had no psychotherapy for any of the people in there. It was all chemotherapy, which, of course, was never curative. Again, giving somebody Thorazine who has schizophrenia is not going to cure them. It's just going to so, immobilize them that they will not have the same degree of problems. So all of the therapy, anything that was not chemotherapy, was done by volunteers. So I was a volunteer, and I would go in and do things with people. And again, I wasn't a staff member, I was a student. And I remember one day I was ready to come out of the ward, and I went to the person who they had changed the guard, And I was going, okay, I'm ready to go home now. Sure. Of course. Oh, no, I'm not a patient here, I'm a volunteer. Right. Sure. It's like, no, really, you don't understand, according to whom, Well, then I suddenly realized as a volunteer, who, when they changed that person, it was like how it was. We had to do a lot of processing after I finally did get my way out. But
was I crazy or not?
Bateson once did a very interesting experiment where I think it was with John Weakland and a psychiatrist in this. At MRI, at this mental research place that they were working at. I think it was the Palo Alto Veterans Hospital, California, where they didn't know each other, and he knew they didn't know each other, and so he told each one that the other one was a patient. So the psychiatrist and Weakland, who was a therapist, were meeting each other, and it was the most bizarre interaction, of course. And you begin to realize, by the way, how much, and this, Linda, part of it comes back to this issue of thought virus too, that the expectation and the interpretation of people's behavior, if you go, this person is crazy, starts to really make a big difference. So you get this self-reflexive issue with craziness. Now, by the way, there's another classic paradox that is not even in the vein of this catch-22. It's called the barber's paradox, and it's a little bit like this catch-22. Barber's paradox is this. There's a small village, and in this village, the barber of the village shaves every man in the village. The barber shaves every man. He's a man. Just a male barber, and he shaves every man in the village who does not shave himself. So obviously the barber is going to shave everybody who doesn't shave himself. So does the barber shave himself? If the barber doesn't shave himself, then he has to shave himself, right? Because he has to shave everybody who doesn't shave himself. But if he shaves himself, he can't shave himself because he only shaves the people who don't shave themselves. So you got this thing, if you're crazy, you're not crazy, but if you're not crazy, you're crazy, So now those are called logical paradoxes. And again, as I said, that's one of those interesting things that begins to create so-called double bind. Now, so let's do a little backtracking. What we know about double binds, and again, I think that these are things, I don't think anything we're telling you is anything new. I think in the same way that actually none of NLP is really anything new.
It's really impactful hearing it all at the same time, though, isn't it?
And our goal now is we're going to start to chunk down. We're going to begin the process of chunking it down, and through the chunking it down, start to find the small chunks of the solutions. We said that double binds are different than either choice or conflict, even though, paradoxically, double binds often involve a so-called choice, or what we might call a pseudo-choice. You choose, but you're not really choosing in the sense of free choice. Number two, we said it's also different than simple conflict. Conflict is, you can often have that sense of win, lose, if I do this, I lose that, if I do this, I lose that.
But you can bust out of it.
Yeah. So notice the difference. I go, if I do A, the thing about conflict is I go, if I do A, I lose with respect to B, and if I do B, I lose with respect to A. Double bind is if I do A, I lose, and if I don't do A, I lose. It's not an A or a B. It's like if I do it, I lose, and if I don't do it, I lose. So it's not even about two choices. Remember we used to say in NLP that one choice is no choice at all.
Right.
It's not really a choice to say do it or not do it. That's not a choice. Two is a dilemma.
And that's when you get the conflict.
Yeah. And it's not until you have three things that you really even begin to have an actual free choice. So we said it's not even a win-lose, it's a lose-lose. And then one of the things that we've been now exploring is that it often involves confusions of logical levels. And the confusion of logical levels creates a type of paradox. Okay?
Creates this circular thing.
We're going to add in, there's clearly other parts of a double bind. In just a few moments, we're going to start going over all of the ingredients that Gregory defined for a double bind. Remember we said there's multiple ingredients that make different degrees of double binding. So that's where we are. Well, now as we said, we're going to get a little more serious here. And interestingly enough, a lot of the examples that we took, or that we were using, do happen to come from military situations.
Isn't that interesting?
And I think that probably on the one hand, in a certain way, my own this is purely a personal, not a metaposition statement, but a personal statement is that I think that war is essentially a double bind. I think it, in fact, after the Battle of Waterloo, Wellington said, the only thing worse than losing a battle is winning it. No, sorry, the only thing worse than winning a battle is losing it.
That makes more sense.
Yeah. And meaning that it was awful. He did not feel victorious. And I think that war has that kind of aspect to it. Certainly there's positive intentions. I think there are positive qualities. People learn things like courage, etc., but you learn things from double binds too. And but I think that part of the reason that so many things come out of war situations is that war in and of itself probably is a double bind, is created by double binds, and makes those nested loops of them. So
The next three examples come from a movie called Full Metal Jacket.
By Stanley Kubrick. He's there doing this drilling, and he puts it on the wrong side first.
Get it on the right side.
So then the sergeant comes over and says, "You're dumb, but you do expect me to believe that you don't know your left from your right." Now, what's he going to say? Yes, I expect you to believe that. I mean, whatever
he says is wrong.
Yeah. So he says, "No, I don't expect you to believe it. Then you did it on purpose.
Yeah.
You're trying to screw me." There's an interesting thing you'll often find, of course, part of what is a key to double binds, as in many other problems, is the assumption of negative intention. So then you did that on purpose.
You knew better, but you did it anyway.
Are you trying to ruin my... it's an interesting thing. Remember I said about this strange sort of reversal of reality. The woman that says, "Don't anchor me when I'm helpless." I'm going, well... It seems so. It was the complete opposite of everything I was saying. Here, this person said, well, how can you do this to me? Why are you doing this to me? Hits him. Is that your left or your right? Well, again, what's going to happen with this guy is that whatever he says, he's going to get hit. Whatever's going to happen, it's going to escalate. So he's damned if he says whatever answer he gives. So again, you get that kind of interesting part of the... Now, there's another interesting thing that we did not put in here, partially, again, because some of these things get so... they're so painful to watch, but there's a certain point where the Pyle, the one who made the mistake and he was slapping around, there's a certain point where he starts talking to this guy and he says something, and the guy kind of... It's one of those things where his response to the confusion is to laugh. And then, of course... The drill sergeant really takes that negatively, and he does this really strange thing where he has the guy kneel down, he puts his hand up, and he has the guy kneel down and choke himself on his hand, on the sergeant's hand. Which is one of those real interesting things. So you have to choke yourself on my hand.
I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to make you hurt yourself.
But of course, if you don't hurt yourself, I am really going to hurt you. So you get the choice. You can choke yourself on my hand.
I'll do something.
And it's just these incredible, you really get the sense of these incredible ambiguities.
Yes.
Now, if you all...
I'm not free.
Well, but by the way, one of the things that I found in my own work, and it's part of the reason I wanted to do this workshop and wanted to develop it with Susie and Tim, is that I started to notice that even when I would start to talk about double binds or give examples, people who have had strong double binding experiences will easily fall into them. I mean, you just, it's a little bit like the attractor basin. You get pulled right into it. So I thought, again, even NLP people, we need to develop those sequences of the small chunk skills that help us to address them, help us to get out of it.
That's a big part of it, is the illusion that these are the only options.
Yeah. Exactly. I'd like to now go to the bottom of page 3 and the top of page 4, go over a couple of these examples, and we'll go over what Bateson called the ingredients for the double bind. And remember, these are all degrees. It's not that you have to have all 5, and if you don't have all 5, there is no double bind. All of them are part of creating double binds. Alleviating any one of them will make the double bind less, but it won't necessarily, deal with it completely. It's kind of like there's a combination of all of these things. So the first ingredient is that there's an intense relationship, which the individual who feels the victim, in this case it would be the privates. We've seen a bunch of examples where there are people who are the privates in the Air Force or the Army. But it's vitally important. When this guy is in your face, when the Pyle is there with his gun and this guy is in your face, it's vitally important that you discriminate what is being communicated to you so you can answer it. I mean, when he's yelling in that guy's face, "What's your excuse? Do I make you nervous?" In those moments, it feels vital. Your survival is on the line.
You better come up with the right answer.
And typically, it's complementary, and this goes back to your comment, where one person is in a so-called, quote, let's call it a quote-unquote position of power. Sergeant, private,
Parent, child.
teacher, student. The opposite of power is dependence. So think about that for just a moment. The more dependent I am on something, the more power it has over me. And now, what does dependence mean? Dependence means I have no other choices. Why do we say that a young baby is dependent on the mother or the parents? It's because there's no other way. They don't have any other choice. They can't go and say, I don't like you,
I think I'm going to call somebody else.
I can have the stork take me back, or something. You don't have a choice. So, in terms of the so-called law of requisite variety, the less choices, the less other possibilities you have, the more dependent you are. Period. It's that simple. Power is the opposite of dependence. The more choices I have, the more power I have with respect to it. The more I can say, hey, screw you. I got a million other choices. I don't need this. I don't have to do this. I got plenty of other possibilities. So this is one very, very important thing. And in this so-called position of power, I, as the seeming victim, the reason that I'm the victim is I don't have any other choice. The people in the army cannot leave. They can't say, this is crazy. I'm going to go AWOL here. I'll see you later. You can't do that.
Once you signed up.
Or are drafted.
On the other hand, the more dependent I am, the more power I've got.
That's right.
Well,
could exist without any practice.
exactly. Well, that's where we say you get this interesting thing. So I put in quotes, position of power.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about dependent is I've had several friends in the last few years who have been going through divorce. And even though they're peers, man, woman, no one supposedly has any power. Depending upon the choices of the individuals in the situation, it's perceived that one is more dependent than the other. Depending upon their money, their status, their jobs, and things like that.
Yeah. Now, it also says here that the relationship is thus other-oriented. And I want you to really notice that. That's one of the key conditions. It's an intense relationship, and it becomes other-oriented. Notice even this sergeant is going, you are ruining this, and the people have to please that sergeant. I mean, they have to find the right answer for that sergeant. So everything is other-oriented. It is not a self-referenced relationship. It is other-referenced.
And it's external.
And it's external.
Mm-hmm.
On both parties.
Mm-hmm. Both parties are.
That's what makes it so interesting. And again, notice that, by the way, by understanding the structure of it, we also begin to understand some of the possible solutions. So one of the possible solutions is self-reference. Somehow.
In your body, in your heart.
Yeah. What is it that I feel? What do I want? As it says here, let's keep going to the conditions. So that's number one. Number two, the person in the so-called position of power is expressing two orders of message, and one is denying the other. Now this, again, the more that this happens, the more there's a double bind. This is the paradox part, right? The two orders of message in the catch-22 are that in order to be crazy, if you're crazy, you can be released, but you have to ask to be released, and to do that, you're not crazy. So that the two things deny each other. Now, Bateson gives this example, so let's go into it in a little bit of detail. He says that there's what he calls a primary negative injunction. Now, injunctions mean, do this. That's an injunction. An injunction is a very strong, declarative statement that says act, choose, answer me, blah, 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 blah. And a negative injunction is one that says don't do something. And we already know from NLP all of the great problems with negative injunctions, Private, I said don't think of blue right now. Don't think of blue. Do you understand me? Yes, I understand you. Then how you're thinking of blue if you understand me? Right? If you understand it, you have to be thinking of blue. So boom, So again, the negative injunctions have those strange qualities already. It's not even an injunction of what to do, it's of what not to do. Don't offend me, don't backtalk to me, don't do this, don't do that. Don't. So the primary one is always negative, so it always starts off by avoidance.
So it's an away from.
Yeah.
An away from in metaphor.
Yeah. It gets even more complicated where the second example says, if you don't do it. That's another one because now it's like, if you don't do this, you're in trouble. Then there is a so-called secondary injunction which conflicts with the first one. That's where you're getting the catch-22 element of it. And it's usually at a more abstract level. Okay, so you got to be crazy, but then you have to ask to be crazy. But if you ask to be crazy at a more abstract level, you're not crazy because who would ask that? So you've got the so-called levels of abstraction. This is again another one. The secondary injunction, like the first, is also enforced by punishments or signals about survival. You know, and you'll see this. One of the things that this particular sergeant does really well is he turns everything into an issue of survival. You know, you take a little thing and you make it an issue of survival. You know, the second message is commonly communicated non-verbally. Now, we're going to kind of play with that a little bit because it can also be verbal. I mean, catch-22, what makes it, doesn't necessarily solve it, but it makes it easier to track is that at least it's verbal. When those things are non-verbal, it gets really tricky.
There's an implied posture, positioning in this. Someone
Yeah.
has the authority to make that distinction
Yeah.
between who is in charge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good point.
Yes. Well, I think that's the other thing we'll see, too, is that the system, oftentimes what you're going to find is that double binds are created because there's two people in a system here, and the system is actually bigger. And remember, you cannot solve the problem at the same level that the problem is created. And I think that's where you'll start to get the... So again, whether you've got the chaplain and the private, they're both in the same catch-22. The only way to get out of it is going to be to start to chunk up. So I think this is interesting. I just want to point this out. The second can impinge upon or conflict with the first in a number of different ways. So it could say, this is under number 2 still, the last part of number 2. It says, for example, you could go, if you don't do that, I'm going to punish you, but this isn't a punishment. You know, this is for your own good. You know. Another one that's really interesting is, okay, if you don't submit to me, you know, I'm gonna beat you up, but you better not submit to me, you know, you coward. So it's like the guy saying, you know, choke yourself on me, you better submit, I'm gonna get you, but if you submit, you know, then then you're really nothing. I'll be on your case the rest of the time. So you get this really interesting thing. You know, I'm demanding your obedience, unquestioned obedience, but you better not submit. Because if you submit, you're not strong. Becomes pretty heavy stuff. And this other one, you know, don't do, like, it's about the don't think of blue. Don't think of blue, but don't think about what you're not supposed to think about. You know, or something like that. That's that one. Or do not question my intention, my love, you know. That's that one. I'm only doing this. I'm doing this for your own good. Right. That's that reversal of the power. So, point number 3 then, and I think this is a really key one. And again, you'll see in some of our examples, it's part of the way out as well. All of these, the thing that makes them feel bad and the thing that makes them hard is also the key to the way out of it. The more I can sort those messages, the more I can recognize them, the more I can begin to get out. Number 3 says, the dependent individual is unable to comment on the messages being expressed in order to correct her perception of discrimination of how to respond. In other words, what Bateson says is you can't make a meta-communicative statement. You cannot say, you know, I'm in a double bind, or I'm confused by this, or this doesn't make sense, or I'm getting 2 messages.
Gee, I don't get this. You can't even do that.
And the reason that you can't is either A, because you're not permitted to. That is, that making the meta-communicative statement is like not responding. You know, it's also wrong. Or And I think this is often as much the situation as anything else, or because it's so convoluted and confusing, you don't know what to, you can't meta-communicate. You don't know how to put it into words. And I've seen that happen. I've seen this with my kids. They get stuck, and they know that they're in a double bind, but they don't know how to put it into words. So the only thing they know how to do is to strike out, is to hit or to act out. I mean, I've seen my own son and my daughter start, bouncing off the walls because it's the only way they know how to deal with it. They can't say, Dad, I'm confused, or I don't know how to deal with it. I'm getting 2 messages. You said this and this. And again, even if I'm not intending to do it, I'll recognize later what a double bind they were in.
And in abusive family situations, I've met adults who could not speak up as a child. Now that they're confronting their parents, they're saying, "Why didn't you say so?"
Yeah, their parents are going, "Why didn't you say so?"
Yeah, you're
it's
wrong because
interesting.
you didn't say anything.
Yeah.
Back then.
There's then number 4. I always love Gregory's language. I actually have to say I find this endearing, but not everybody does. A tertiary negative injunction. 3 nominalizations right in a row. No, tertiary negative injunction basically means you can't leave. So if you can't, you're in this intense relationship, your survival's on the line, you've got these different messages that are going on, you can't sort them out, you can't comment on the problem, and you cannot leave. You can't go, look, I need a break. That's the part of you cannot leave the field. You got to stay right here. You cannot check out. It's when the guy's he's saying choke yourself, the guy can't say, wait a minute, I need a few moments to think about this. You cannot leave. It's right there.
If you leave, it means you don't love me. It means
Yeah.
you're not respecting me. So
Or you're breaking another rule. It's again the nested binds. And then number 5, it's a repeated, this I think is important, it's a repeated experience and not a single traumatic event. Meaning it's not just an imprint. And again, remember, these are degrees of double binds. The more it's repeated, the more it becomes part of your natural way of perceiving reality. You start to carry it with you. So it's not just a bad feeling that you get in certain circumstances when you're reminded of it, like the kind of imprint things. It becomes an ongoing part of you.
And it becomes so habitual that it's just that's the way it is. I mean, isn't that how life is?
There's one other element that I add from my own experience that Gregory did not say formally here. It is written in here. I mean, all this is discussed. But to me, what Gregory does not point out explicitly here is that I believe that there are negative identity messages. Mm-hmm. And that in fact, that's what I call, it turns a double bind into a triple whammy, if you want to call it that. And the third part is that there is an interpretation that the fact that you are in the double bind and can't resolve it is a negative statement about who you are as a person. It's the proof of all of the rest of the tension. So, for example, there's an example on page 4, the one with the boys. There's a schizophrenic boy. Gregory was talking about observing these schizophrenic families. He said this boy was hospitalized for schizophrenia. He would act out, and after some time, the boy had become stable enough that he was able to receive visitors. So his mother came, and upon greeting her son, she says to the boy, how about giving your mother a hug? Because she's in the social system. How about giving your mother a hug? So again, it's the injunction: do this, or either it's not appropriate or there's something wrong. So the boy gives her a hug, and she visibly stiffens up. So it says, giving me the hug is making me feel uncomfortable. So then the boy stops. He's gotten the conflicting message. So he stops, and then she says, what's wrong? Don't you love your mother? So now he's confused. And he starts going into this funny thing, and then the triple whammy comes when she says, really, you really have to learn to control your emotions better. What's wrong with you? In other words, the fact that he is in the double bind and confused by it, she says, you must learn to control your emotions better if you're going to get out of here, And according to Bateson, very shortly after, he had a violent episode and had to be restrained. So you get this interesting thing that there's also a third message that sneaks in there.
I'm no good.
Yeah. There's an example from the book Mary Poppins, not the movie, but the book, where there's the Banks kids go to a store, and there's these two, they notice these two kind of strange acting little kids are in the store. They're behind the counter. They're clearly the children of the woman who runs it. The woman comes out and she looks at him and she says, well, have you given the children a cookie yet? And they go, oh no, Mother, we'll do that right away. Who said you could give them a cookie? You know. So all of a sudden, you know, they interpreted the one message, you know, have you given them a cookie yet? You know, like, why haven't you? And then, we'll do that right away. Who said you could do that? And then they're caught in this confusion, and then the mother goes, look at you, what's wrong with you? You know, why are you acting this way, you weak, stupid children? So, in other words, you are stupid and weak for being in the double bind. Just like Sergeant Pyle. Pyle, you know, you're showing me more and more that you're an idiot here by not being able to resolve this double bind, by being in the double bind. And so I think that's another key characteristic. What we want to do now is this. We're going to start to go into this. We're going to have you make double binds so you can get out of them. Now, the way we're going to do it is we won't make them severe double binds. Remember, there's different degrees, you know. There's like first degree, second degree, and third degree murder. Well, these will only be these won't be the third degree ones. Right. But rather, we're going to ask you to kind of construct some things. Again, you could imagine, as Dan was saying, we're going to enact them as two people, but these could be two parts. Okay? And what we'll do is Susie and I are first going to kind of role play this a little bit with somebody. Now, again, to keep the relationship from becoming too intense, we're going to actually, whoever's going to be the volunteer, we're not going to really be putting you in the double bind. We're going to be putting Tim in the double bind. So since he's not here, so we're just going to be asking you to role play Tim. But also, as we know from surrogate work, if we can get Tim out of the double bind, then maybe there will be some. Anyway. So we'll get a chair for Tim. Okay, so we need a Tim. Somebody want to be Tim?
That's the name of my message.
Okay. All right. So we'll kind of also play this out a little bit. So we'll go, hi, Tim. Good to see you.
Hi.
So you know what, Tim, you know, we've got a lot of planning to do for the stuff on the HCT. I really think that we should go. You need to come with me, and we're going to go and do some planning because it would be safe. And you know, we had this big problem with this last seminar that we did, this workshop, and you know, Susie and I had to really deal with a lot of difficulties because we didn't plan it well and think it through well. So let's go and do some planning for the future. Yeah, it'll be safe. It'll be a way of protecting ourselves in the future.
Well, Tim, you see, we're in this absolutely exquisite surroundings. Instead of doing that, I think we ought to just go for a walk in the woods. I mean, it would be so much fun to just go out and walk in the woods because we don't get in this kind of a setting.
Couldn't you put that
But wait, Tim. Please don't go for a walk with her, because if you go for a walk, it won't be safe. I mean, first of all, we won't be doing what we need to do. Besides, I don't know. I haven't been out there. Other things could happen. But mostly, if you do go do that, you're jeopardizing our future.
Well, Tim, don't go plan with the workshop stuff with Robert, because it won't be any fun. You know what a drudgery it is to go.
Might I leave the system?
Well, but no, because Tim, if you don't come with me and plan now, not only are you going to be jeopardizing your future, you're going to be jeopardizing my future and the future of the whole health community. You know, really, so if you don't come with me and do this right now, we are putting this community at risk. And
if you don't go for a walk right now, you're never going to be able to have any fun. I mean, you'll be so boring.
Besides, you're ruining Susie's chance. Sorry.
it's really hard.
But you know what? Come, your indecision is screwing things up. Your indecision is unsafe. Your indecision is risking things.
And I'm not having any fun at all
Seriously.
here because you're not deciding.
Yeah. How could you do this to me?
You're just sitting there. Yeah, what are you trying to do?
What a jerk. What a jerk. He's a jerk, is it? He's a jerk.
Yeah.
Okay, so, all right. You can stop for a moment. You can. Okay, now let's stand behind the chair. Ulrich, you're not Tim. Tim is in the chair. Now let's take a little bit of a look here.
Rest of you breathe.
And breathe. Now, at first we had a kind of it could have been a choice. Let's go plan, it's safe, we need to plan our future. Oh, let's go for a walk, it's fun. It's a kind of a dilemma. But then what did I do to start making it not just a choice? I said, no, don't go for a walk. Okay, if you go for a walk, then you are putting this at risk. So it's not just that, okay, let's do this is safe and that's fun, choose between safe and fun. It's, no, doing that is actually risky.
And then I said, no, don't go do this.
It's boring.
It's boring. It won't be any fun.
Yeah, it'd be as boring as me. We don't have this chance. I mean, look at this environment. We're almost done here. And we're not going to have this chance again. So you start it's not just do this because it's of this criteria and do that because of this criteria. It's no doing that invalid. That's win-lose, of course. At first it was this because we'll win this way, that because we'll win that way. Now, but doing that loses here. Now I'm going to lose if you do what Susie wants to do.
And that means we lose over here.
So the thing that starts to make it more of a conflict is win-lose.
Uh-huh.
Okay, then we started going, and if you don't, and this is an interesting thing, then we start to develop the relation part. If you don't come with me, it's not just that you're putting this at risk, you're putting me at risk, you're putting the whole community at risk. How can you do that? How can you do that?
And I could have said, hey, you're putting our relationship at risk if you don't go for a walk with me right now.
Right. Because it's not just that you're not going to have any fun. It's not just that you're not going to have any fun doing this boring thing. You're ruining my chance, my only chance to have fun.
Yes.
I've put in so much effort into this program. I've been here. The least you could do is to give me a chance to have a little fun. Yeah.
This reminded me right now a hell of a lot of family situation. Actually, when the two you were fighting and struggling, I felt released and said, okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Let's them do it.
Yeah. But then notice, the whammy, though, starts to become when we go, your indecision is screwing things up. It's not even now that deciding to go with Susie is wrong. You're not deciding, this is really dangerous. You're not deciding.
So you're a bad person.
Yeah. How can you do this to me? How can you sit there and not decide?
And that's the message from both of us.
And then we both go, then we both go, yeah, what a jerk. Yeah, right, he's a jerk.
You're ruining.
Then we're not in conflict anymore. Our conflict is resolved.
Now it's the relationship between the two of you.
Yeah.
And he's locked out of it.
Yeah.
In order to play the game, Tim had to accept the validity of the contrived equivalence.
That's right. That's right.
Not violent.
That's right. And Jim, yeah. First of all, there's an illusion of choice, we might call it. There's kind of an illusion of choice, and then as Jim is saying, he has to somehow accept that it would be unsafe to do this. I mean, that's where you get in the sleight of mouth stuff, and you get all the rest of the belief issues. I am making a cause-effect statement, and we're making complex equivalences and causes and effects, which is the nature of belief. And again, double binds are based on beliefs. The sad thing is that they're not just, if they just stayed beliefs, it would be like the catch-22. You'd go around in circles and go, oh, this is confusing. Does the barber shave himself or doesn't he? But if you said, decide now whether he shaves himself, and if you give the wrong answer, you're going to get your head cut off, all of a sudden it's not so much fun anymore.
What I experienced right now was as Tim, I didn't have the idea to ask the two of you, let's do it together.
Yeah.
So let's make a walk together and talk about it. I got the idea the moment I got up. And
That's
time to think about it.
Now, see, that is the other part, and it has to do with the issue of complex equivalences. That Jim, your point, you accept the complex equivalence, and the other part of the complex equivalence is that you cannot do both at the same time. And that's why Bateson said it's the cause of craziness and it's the cause of genius. You can't solve a problem at the same level it's created. What Ulrich just did is say, yeah, let's take a walk and plan.
Right. But you realize when you're coming at you how confusing it is. And I
didn't have any idea about that. The moment I got up and had a bit of time, then I thought, gee, why don't we, let's do it together.
Yeah. So, again, that's also the other interesting thing about double binds. Bateson actually has, we all know, of course, the porpoise story, right? The porpoise getting the thing. Bateson called that story he told under the title Double Bind Revisited.
Double bind?
Double Bind Revisited. Because his point was that porpoise, that dolphin, is in a double bind. The porpoise is wrong if he does what he did before, and he's wrong if he doesn't do anything. I mean, he doesn't know what the trainer wants. And he is supposed to be performing. And there's an audience sitting there. And the porpoise has got to do something. He can't just sit there and say, well, gee, I don't know what to do. I better take a time out here. The trainer is, he's got to demonstrate to this group how they train the porpoise. And if the porpoise doesn't do something new, then they're all in trouble. That's a little interesting, I think, clue too about that the trainer is not going, I think I want to double bind my porpoise. The trainer is under this pressure too. And when the porpoise goes, now I got it, the porpoise jumped levels, he's out of the double bind. He's out of the double bind. And notice, part of that, I think part of what happens is, the porpoise stops trying to please the others. Again, it stops being the other reference. You get to the meta position. You somehow are able to get distance. And all of a sudden you begin to realize that it's not, you sort out the message, it's not only going to be on these two terms. It doesn't have to be that way. So bravo.
Yes, you changed levels.
Yeah. That, by the way, is, I think, part of the genius of Erickson. I think that Erickson would sit around and listen to the double binds people would get in and then do that. Let's do both at the same time. And of course, after you hear it, you go, duh. Well, it's so obvious. Why didn't I think about it there? Don't you have those responses, Erickson stories? It's like, yeah, of course. It's so obvious. So, now, let's take this back apart. So first of all, thank you, Ulrich.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. What we'd like to actually ask you to do, if you would, is to find a partner, and we're going to ask you to create one of these double binds. I'll just write it up, and we'll kind of summarize what Susie and I did. Again, I think if we just write a couple of the simple words. So the first thing is, and this is for each person now, so this is for one half. You're going to say, do X. So that's a behavior. So that's let's plan or take a walk or whatever it is. Because,
find the criteria.
And we'll say A maybe. Okay, and then what happens the next time is the other person will say, no, let's do Y because of B or something. But that still is not the bind yet. You've got, okay, I'm just kind of in a little bit of a struggle here. The next part is, don't do Y, that is the other person's thing, because it will violate A. So now you've got that, remember we were talking about the negative injunction. You can't have the double bind without the negative. So That's when, remember, and I think again, Ulrich started to feel, that's when you really start feeling a little bit trapped. Well, first is a dilemma, but then it's like you're starting to get trapped. The third one is, if you don't X. So now we're going back to the first one. So do X because of this, don't do Y because it will violate that, and if you don't do X, that's where you start getting, as Dan was saying, the real trap that all the time and space is taken away. If you don't do X, and we might even say now, then you are not only violating A for you, but for many others. That's where you intensify the relationship. Not only is it just for you, it's for me, it's for everybody. In other words, you are ruining everything.
You're disappointing.
Yeah. How could you disappoint?
Letting the family down.
Yeah. Then you are harming, others. At A, with respect to A. Then, with respect to A. So, A is the criterion. Maybe I'll make that so A is the criterion. Then you go between, you have two things, like I'm saying, let's plan because it's safe, but don't go for a walk, that's the Y, because it won't be safe. In fact, it'll be risking, you'll be putting things at risk. And if you don't plan right now, then you're harming a lot of other people. So what we're going to ask you to do is to come up with some of these that you could role play. Now, what you might want to do, some of you might want to take your own little inner conflicts and or like we were doing with Tim. I know that these are not. This is not the first time that we've been through these kinds of things, Susie and Tim and I. So you might take either issues or maybe issues that a client has given you. So you can use this as an opportunity just to break something into that structure. Okay. Then when you're done after lunch, then you get to put somebody else into it, and so then you get to apply it to somebody, and the others are going to help you. You'll pair up with another group, and they'll also help to get out of it. Let's backtrack. I want to just backtrack really quickly through the process, the form. Whatever you've done, by the way, remember, whatever you've done, as long as you're ready to be able to kind of do a role play similar to what we did with Ulrich, the idea would be that Susie and I would have constructed a kind of role play double bind, and you're going to get together with another pair. One of the members of those pairs will volunteer to be the one in the middle, and you will say the things to that person like Susie and I were saying to Ulrich. The fourth person is going to be there as a coach and a lifeline for the one in the middle. Okay. So, and we'll tell you, we're going to give you some of the things to coach. Now, but before we go into that, I just wanted to be real clear about what I meant by this form. So remember, we said the first part was a do A, and Bob gave me permission to